Welcome to, today we're diving deep into Indian politics.
Always exciting.
It is fascinating, right?
Yeah.
And we've got, I think, like the ultimate guide with us today. We're talking Indian Polity by M. Laxmikanth.
Yes.
If you want to understand Indian politics, this seems to be like the book. So,
It's the Bible.
yeah,
It's the Gita, the Bible, everything rolled into one for Indian politics.
I love that. I'm going to steal that. But one of the things that jumps out right away is just how many political parties there are in India.
Oh my God.
This is not like a two-party system. We're talking thousands, right?
Absolutely.
Like thousands.
It really speaks, I think, to the, scale and diversity of India, right? I mean, you've got so many different languages, cultures, religions, ethnicities, what have you, and it's only natural that that diversity is reflected in the political system, right? You've got a very vibrant, heterogeneous society.
Okay, so I love that you use the word vibrant, because when I see thousands of political parties, I think, oh my gosh, how does anything get done?
Right.
Like, it seems like it would be very difficult to get any consensus on anything.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair point, but you have to remember that not all parties are created equal, right? So you've got, on the one hand, you've got these what are called national parties, right? These are parties that have a presence across the country. They typically have a much broader appeal. They focus on these big national issues, right? But then on the other hand, and this is where it gets really interesting, you have this vast constellation of regional parties. And these are parties that are much more locally rooted. They might be confined to a particular state or even a region within a state.
So it's not just national versus regional. There's even like layers within that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that Laxmikanth really emphasizes is this distinction between national and regional parties isn't just about, geographic scope. It's also about, the kinds of issues that they champion, the constituencies that they cater to, and really the role that they play in this broader political system. So, for example, I mean, you could have a regional party, like, let's say, the DMK in Tamil Nadu, right?
Okay.
The DMK, which stands for the Dravida Munnetra Kazhagam, and I apologize for my pronunciation.
No, you got it.
But anyway, this is a party that's been around since the 1940s.
Oh.
And it's very much rooted in, Tamil identity, Tamil language, Tamil culture.
Okay.
And they've played a very significant role in Tamil Nadu politics.
It's fascinating. So what you're saying is even though they're a regional party, they can still be incredibly powerful and influential.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, I would argue that in many ways, regional parties are, in a sense, the lifeblood of Indian politics because they really capture that kind of local flavor, that local sentiment that often gets missed, I think, when you just focus on the national level.
So what is it that really drives these regional parties then? Are they just like mini versions of national parties, or is there something more specific?
Well, I think one of the things that Laxmikanth really teases out is that they really are driven by kind of hyper-local issues.
Okay.
Right? So it could be something like, water rights, right? Or agricultural policies, or even something as specific as, preserving a particular cultural tradition or language. And these are all issues that, might resonate very, very deeply with people at the local level.
Yeah.
But they might not necessarily be, top of mind for these big national parties.
Right, because they're thinking much more broadly.
Exactly.
So it's like this direct line then that those communities have to make sure that their concerns are addressed.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons why, you often see these regional parties punching above their weight, so to speak, in terms of their influence, because they really are able to mobilize people around these very, very specific issues.
So we've got this huge constellation, this vibrant tapestry of political parties.
Right.
But how does that actually translate into governing, right? Because I would imagine with this many voices, this many different interests, it would be very difficult to get anything done.
Yeah. And this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because India, more often than not, ends up with what's called a coalition government.
Okay.
Which means that no single party wins a clear majority in the parliament.
Wow.
So they have to cobble together these alliances, these partnerships with other parties in order to form a government.
And those parties they form these coalitions with, do they always have to have like the exact same ideologies, or can it be?
Oh, absolutely. No, I mean, in fact, I would say that that's part of what makes it so fascinating, right? Because you might have parties that are, ideologically on opposite ends of the spectrum.
Wow.
But they find themselves having to work together.
Out of necessity.
Out of political expediency, out of necessity. And you know what? Sometimes it works surprisingly well.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, it's really quite remarkable because it forces these parties to compromise, to
Right.
negotiate, to really find that middle ground.
Okay, so walk me through, like, how does that process even work?
Well, imagine this, right?
Okay.
The elections have just concluded,
Yeah.
and no party has that magic number
Right.
to form the government.
Yeah.
So now begins this kind of frantic period of what I call political matchmaking,
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
right? Where parties start sending out feelers,
Okay.
they start, backroom negotiations, and it's all about who can we partner with? What are the compromises we're willing to make? What are the red lines that we absolutely will not cross?
Right. What are you willing to give up
Hmm.
in order to get some of what you want?
Exactly. It's a very, very delicate dance.
So it's almost like kind of this high-stakes game then
Absolutely.
of political maneuvering.
Absolutely. It's high stakes, it's high drama, and, it's something that Laxmikanth goes into in quite a bit of detail, and he actually provides some really fascinating examples
Oh, okay.
of, coalition governments that have been formed in the past,
Okay.
the challenges that they face, the successes that they've had, the failures. I mean, it's really a mixed bag.
It's so interesting because I feel like we often have this kind of, I guess, very simplistic view of how government works.
Right.
Like one party wins, the other party loses, and then, okay, well, we know what's going to happen for the next 4 years.
Right.
But in a system like India, where you have
Yeah.
these coalitions, it's like you never really know what's going to happen next.
You're absolutely right. And I think, one of the things that Laxmikanth really underscores, I think, is that, this idea of coalition politics, it's not just a matter of, political expediency.
Yeah.
It actually reflects something much deeper
Okay.
about the nature of Indian democracy, right? It's
sure.
about this idea of, consensus building, of
Wow.
accommodating diversity, of, finding ways to bridge these very, very different perspectives.
Wait, so even though it might seem messy or chaotic from the outside,
Right.
there's actually something maybe even more almost hopeful about it.
I think so because it suggests that, ultimately in a democracy as diverse, as vibrant, as complex as India's,
Yeah.
there has to be this element of give and take, right?
Yeah.
You can't just have one party or one ideology that dominates.
Okay.
And that's why these coalitions, as messy and as complicated as they might be, they actually, I think, reflect the true spirit
Yeah.
of what Indian democracy is all about.
So I love that you've painted this picture of this really dynamic system, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you have all these different parties, these different ideologies.
Yeah.
And it's not just a simple, okay, well, this side won, this side lost. It's much more nuanced than that.
Absolutely.
But then that brings up, okay, well, then how do elections even work in a system like this? I mean, we're talking about a country with over 1 billion people.
Right.
So how do you even begin to organize an election on that scale?
It's a mammoth undertaking. There's no doubt about it.
Right.
But you know what? India has done a remarkable job of creating a system that is surprisingly efficient and generally considered to be very free and fair.
Okay.
And this is something that Laxmikanth actually spends quite a bit of time discussing, and he talks about, the role of the Election Commission, which is this independent body that oversees the entire electoral process.
Okay.
He talks about the different stages of the election, from the announcement of the election date to the filing of nominations to the actual campaigning itself, and then of course the counting of votes and the declaration of results. I mean, it's a very, very elaborate process.
And are there certain things that they've done in India to try to make this process, given its size and complexity? Are there things that they've done to make it maybe more efficient or more streamlined?
Absolutely. And I think one of the most significant developments in recent years has been the adoption of electronic voting machines, or EVMs as they're called.
Okay.
And these EVMs have really revolutionized the way elections are conducted in India.
How so?
Well, for starters, they've made the whole process much faster,
Okay.
right? Because you no longer have to count these, millions and millions of paper ballots by hand,
Right.
right? It's all done electronically,
Okay.
which also makes it arguably much more accurate.
Okay.
Right. It reduces the chances of human error
Right.
and also potentially electoral fraud.
Okay.
Right. So it's seen as a big step forward.
It's interesting because I know in the United States, we still very much rely on paper ballots in a lot of places.
Right.
And there's always this debate about, well, should we move to electronic voting? Is it secure enough?
Right.
So it's interesting to hear that India has kind of really embraced this technology.
Yeah. And I think, it's been by and large a success story. I mean, there have been, some concerns raised, about the possibility of tampering with EVMs.
Right.
But the Election Commission has taken a lot of steps to try to address those concerns
Right. Yeah.
and to ensure that the machines are tamper-proof.
Interesting.
So yeah, I think it's definitely something that other democracies, could potentially learn from.
Yeah. Definitely something to keep an eye on. But okay, so we've got the EVMs, we've got the Election Commission.
Right.
But beyond that, are there other ways that India kind of ensures that these elections are fair, given that we have so many parties and it's such a massive undertaking?
Yeah, and this is where I think the idea of electoral reforms comes in, right?
Okay.
Because India has a long history of constantly trying to improve its electoral processes.
Okay.
Right. Of addressing the challenges
Yep.
that emerge and of trying to make its elections, as fair and as representative as possible.
And what are some examples of that? What are some of the reforms that they put in place?
Well, one of the things that Laxmikanth talks about is, campaign finance reform.
Okay.
Right? Because one of the big challenges in any democracy is, the influence of money in politics.
Right.
And India is no exception.
Of course.
So over the years, there have been various attempts to try to regulate campaign spending,
Okay.
to try to limit the amount of money that candidates and parties can spend.
Right. To try to level the playing field a little bit.
Exactly. Exactly. Because the thinking is that, if you don't have these limits in place, then it really becomes a game of who has the deepest pocket.
Right. Exactly.
Right. And that undermines, I think, the very principle of equal representation.
Absolutely. Because if the only people who can afford to run are, billionaires,
Right.
then that really limits the voices and the perspectives that are represented in government.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is something that cuts across, party lines.
Right.
It's an issue that everyone recognizes.
Right.
So it's definitely an area where India has made some strides, but like with any kind of reform,
Yeah.
it's an ongoing process.
Yeah. There's always more work to be done.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we've talked about, the parties, we've talked about the elections, but I think, one of the things that's really fascinating about Indian politics is trying to understand the voters themselves.
Yes, absolutely right. Like, who are these people that are navigating this incredibly complex system?
Exactly. And what motivates them.
Right. What makes them choose one party or one candidate over another?
Right. I mean, is it all about, ideology?
Right.
Is it about, party platforms? Or are there other factors at play? And that's where I think things get really interesting, right? Because when we talk about voting behavior in
Right.
India,
Right.
it's not as simple as just looking at, the national picture.
Right.
You have to really delve into these very, very specific local dynamics.
Okay.
Right? So, for example, Laxmikanth talks about the role of caste,
Okay.
right? Which unfortunately continues to be a very, very significant factor
Right.
in Indian politics. And, this is something that has its roots in India's, long history,
Right.
but it's something that also continues to shape, social and political alliances.
Right. So even though it's not something that's, I guess, formally recognized in the political system,
Right.
it still very much influences how people vote.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's not just about, which caste a particular candidate belongs to.
Okay.
It's also about, these broader caste alliances and rivalries
Yeah.
that exist.
So it can get very complicated very quickly.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, and it's something that parties are very, very aware of.
Right.
Right. And they
Right.
often try to leverage these caste dynamics to their advantage.
It's like they're trying to kind of put together these voting blocks based on these different identities.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, and it's not just caste, right?
Right,
I mean,
yeah.
religion is another
Of course.
very, very important factor.
Right.
And again,
Especially in a country as diverse as India.
exactly. Exactly. I mean, you have, a Hindu majority,
Right.
but you also have a very, very significant Muslim population. You have Sikhs, you have Christians, you have Buddhists. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a incredibly diverse country.
And they all have, their own kind of interests and concerns that they're
guess.
hoping to see represented in government.
Absolutely. And so, political parties, again, are very, very aware of this.
Right.
Right. And they often try to appeal to these different religious communities.
Okay, so we've got caste, we've got religion.
Yeah.
Are there other kind of these identity markers, I guess, that come into play?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, language is another big one,
Okay.
right? Because as we talked about earlier, India has what, 22 official languages?
Right, right.
But there are hundreds of languages and dialects spoken across the country.
Right. That's incredible.
And so, language often becomes a very, very powerful symbol
Right.
of identity, of cultural belonging.
Right.
And it can be a major factor in how people vote.
It's interesting because I was kind of thinking back to what we were talking about before with the DMK.
Right.
And how they're very much rooted in Tamil identity and Tamil language. And that's something that Laxmikanth talks about as well, is, how that party kind of came about.
Yeah.
In part because of this desire to protect Tamil language and culture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, and in fact, if you look at the history of India since independence, one of the most significant kind of political developments has been the reorganization of states.
Okay.
Along linguistic lines.
Oh, wow. So they actually redrew the map of India.
They did. Back in the 1950s. Yeah. There was this huge movement, right,
yeah.
to create states that were based on language.
Right. So that people would feel like
yeah.
their voices were being heard and their cultures were being represented.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, that just goes to show you how powerful this issue of language can be.
It's almost like this underlying current that runs through so much of Indian politics.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's something that any student of Indian politics, really needs to be aware of.
So we've talked about these kind of very personal factors, right?
Yeah.
These identity markers that influence how people vote. But what about like the actual issues, right?
Yeah.
I mean, do those not matter as much in India, or is it more about these deeper allegiances?
No, I mean, I think issues definitely matter.
Right.
And Laxmikanth talks about this as well.
Okay.
I mean, he talks about, issues like economic development.
Right.
Right. Poverty alleviation.
Right, which are huge issues in India.
Huge, huge issues. Access to education, healthcare, infrastructure. I mean, these are all, bread and butter issues.
Right, things that affect people's everyday lives.
Absolutely, absolutely. And they do resonate with voters. But I think what's interesting is that often these national level issues get filtered through this kind of prism.
Right.
Of these more local, more identity-based concerns.
Okay, so it's almost like people might care about these broader issues.
Yeah.
But they're also thinking, okay, well, how is this particular party or this particular candidate, how are they going to address these issues for my community?
Exactly, exactly. So it's this really fascinating interplay between the national and the local, between these kind of broader ideological debates.
Right.
And these very, very specific, community-based concerns.
So it's really all about kind of understanding that interplay between all of these different factors.
Absolutely.
And how they all kind of come together to shape the ultimate decision that a voter makes.
You've got it. And, and I think that's one of the things that makes studying Indian politics so fascinating, because it's not just about looking at kind of the formal institutions or the legal framework.
Right.
You really have to understand kind of what's happening at the grassroots level.
Right, the human side of it.
The human side of it, exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've talked about the parties.
Yeah.
We've talked about the elections. We've talked about the voters themselves.
Yeah.
But it seems like there's this other layer that we haven't really touched on yet.
Okay.
Which is, we've talked about these political parties.
Right.
These are the ones that are kind of officially running for office.
Right.
But then you have all these other groups
that
are operating kind of behind the scenes, that are trying to influence policy, that are championing particular causes.
Right.
And Laxmikanth refers to these as pressure groups.
Pressure groups, exactly.
So tell me a little bit more about, what are pressure groups and what role do they play in Indian politics?
So pressure groups, they're basically, organized groups of people,
okay,
right, who come together based on some shared interest or some shared goal.
Right.
And their whole aim is to try to influence government policy in their favor.
So they're not necessarily trying to get elected themselves. They're trying to influence the people who do get elected.
Exactly. So they're working kind of outside the formal structure
Right.
of government,
Right.
but they're trying to exert their influence
Yeah.
on those who are in power.
And what are some examples of these pressure groups? Because I imagine they can be kind of all over the map in
Oh,
terms
made
of
of
the
absolutely.
yeah.
They run the gamut. Absolutely. I mean, you have, business lobbies,
Okay.
right, who are trying to influence, economic
Oh, yeah.
policy.
To make it easier for them to do business.
Exactly, exactly. You have trade unions,
Okay.
right, who are fighting for workers' rights.
Right.
You have, student groups.
Okay.
You have, religious organizations,
Gotcha.
caste-based organizations.
Right. So really a huge range.
Huge, huge range. And, and they all have their own kind of
Yeah.
modus operandi, right?
Right.
Their own ways of trying to get what they want.
And what are some of those ways? How do these pressure groups actually go about trying to influence policy?
So, some of them, they focus on lobbying,
Okay.
right? So they actually
So they'll meet with politicians.
exactly. They'll wine and dine them. They'll give them campaign contribution.
Right. Try to build those relationships.
Exactly. Others, they might focus more on kind of public awareness campaigns.
Okay.
Right. So they'll organize protests, they'll hold rallies, they'll try to get their message out.
Right. Put pressure on the government that way.
Exactly. And then you have some, who might resort to more kind of, direct action.
Okay.
Right. So things like, strikes,
Okay.
boycotts, even sometimes, violence.
So it can get pretty intense.
It can get pretty intense. And, and I think one of the things that Laxmikanth really emphasizes is that
Yeah.
pressure groups, they can be a force for good.
Okay.
Right. I mean, they can really help to amplify marginalized voices.
Okay.
They can hold the government accountable.
Okay.
But they can also, sometimes be used for less than noble purposes.
Right. Because they can also kind of exert undue influence.
Exactly. And so there's always this tension, right?
Yeah.
Between, on the one hand, wanting to protect, freedom of association,
Right,
freedom
right.
of speech,
Right.
right? And the right of people to organize.
Right.
But also, on the other hand, making sure that that doesn't come at the expense
Right.
of good governance.
Right. Of a level playing field of fairness.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
it's a very, very, it's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
But it's it's part of what makes the Indian political system so dynamic.
Yeah, it's all part of that vibrancy that you were talking about before.
Exactly.
So we've got these pressure groups, right, operating in the background, but they're obviously kind of focused on
Right.
India's domestic situation.
Right.
What's happening within India's borders.
Right.
But India also obviously plays a very important role on the world stage.
Absolutely.
And so I'm curious to kind of shift gears a little bit
Thank
and
you.
talk about, what is India's role in the world?
Okay.
How does it see itself? How do other countries see India?
Okay.
And what are some of the kind of the key issues
Okay.
that are shaping India's foreign policy today?
Sure. Well, I think to understand India's foreign policy, you have to kind of go back to its history a little bit.
Okay.
Because, India, after independence in 1947,
Right.
it emerged from centuries of colonial rule.
Right.
And I think that experience really shaped India's worldview.
In what way?
Well, I think it created this very strong sense of wanting to be
Yeah.
independent. Right. Of not wanting to be aligned
Right.
with any one superpower or bloc.
So not wanting to take sides.
Exactly. And so, India, along with a number of other countries,
Yeah.
kind of spearheaded this movement called non-alignment.
Okay.
Right? Which basically said that, we're not gonna be part of
Right.
the Cold War.
Right.
We're gonna chart our own course.
We're going to do our own thing.
Exactly. We're gonna do our own thing. We're gonna, pursue our own national interests.
Right.
And we're gonna to work with whoever we want to work with.
Okay. So that was kind of the starting point for Indian foreign policy.
That was kind of the bedrock.
The bedrock, yeah.
The foundation, absolutely.
And has that kind of core principle, has that remained or has it evolved over time?
I think at its heart that desire for strategic autonomy,
Okay.
for maintaining its independence, that's still very much there.
Okay.
But of course, the world has changed. Right.
Since 1947.
Right. The Cold War is over.
The Cold War is over. I mean, you have, new superpowers that have emerged.
Right.
The global balance of power has shifted in many ways.
Ugh.
So India has had to to adapt.
Right. So how has it adapted? What are some of the ways in which its foreign policy has maybe shifted or evolved?
Well, I think one of the most notable developments has been
Yeah.
India's kind of growing engagement with the West,
Okay.
right, particularly with the United States.
Okay, and that's interesting because, going back to that idea of non-alignment,
Right.
during the Cold War, India was seen as being much closer
Right.
to the Soviet Union.
Right. So what drove that shift then?
Well, I think there are a couple of factors at play.
Okay.
One is, the end of the Cold War itself,
Okay.
right? I mean, with the collapse of the Soviet Union,
Right.
India lost its kind of main, counterweight
Right.
to the West.
Right. They lost that ally in a sense.
They lost that ally, exactly. And I think,
Yeah.
there was also this recognition that,
Yeah.
India's economic interests
Right.
were increasingly tied to the West.
Right, to the global
And
economy,
the global economy, exactly.
which is much more aligned with the U.S.
Exactly. And so, I think starting in the 1990s,
Yeah.
you really saw this kind of concerted effort
Yeah.
on the part of India to build closer ties with the U.S.
And what's that look like in practice? What are some concrete examples of that?
Well, I mean, one example is, the growing defense cooperation
Okay.
between the two countries.
Okay.
India is now one of the largest buyers
Okay.
of U.S. military equipment.
Yeah.
There's also been, a lot more cooperation on things like counterterrorism,
Right.
intelligence sharing.
Right.
And then, of course, there's the economic relationship,
Right.
which has, grown by leaps and bounds.
So it's really become this kind of multifaceted partnership
Absolutely.
that goes beyond just kind of one particular issue.
Exactly. And I think it's a relationship that's still evolving.
Right. Because there are still obviously some areas where the two countries don't necessarily see eye to eye.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's a bit of a delicate dance, it sounds like.
It is. I mean, India and the U.S., they have different, histories. They have different, strategic interests.
Different values?
Different values, exactly. And so, it's not always easy
Right.
to reconcile those differences.
Right. So it's about finding that balance.
Finding that balance, exactly.
Between, cooperation where they can,
Right.
but also being mindful of those areas where they might disagree.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating. And it sounds like India is walking this similar tightrope in a sense with other countries as well, right? I mean, we're talking about a country that's situated in a very complex region.
Very complex region.
Right. It's got China as a neighbor.
Right.
It's got Pakistan as a neighbor.
Right.
So I imagine, managing those relationships
Right.
is a full-time job in and of itself.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, and this is something that Laxmikanth really emphasizes as well,
Okay.
is that, for India,
Yeah.
foreign policy begins at home.
Right. So what does that mean? What does it mean for India's foreign policy to begin at home?
Well, it means that, India can't really be
Yeah.
a major player on the world stage if it doesn't have,
Yeah.
a stable and prosperous
Right.
neighborhood.
Right. It can't be focused on kind of these global issues
Right.
if it's dealing with conflict
Exactly.
right on its doorstep.
Exactly. And so, a lot of India's foreign policy is really geared towards
Okay.
trying to build closer ties
Right.
with its neighbors, trying to resolve,
Right.
outstanding disputes
Yeah.
and trying to create an environment
Yeah.
where India can really kind of, thrive and prosper.
Right. And that's interesting because it seems like sometimes those two things are at odds with each other, right?
Right.
Because you might have, domestic constituencies
Right.
that are pushing for a more kind of, assertive foreign policy.
Right.
But then on the other hand, you have these very real constraints that are
Right.
imposed by
Exactly.
India's kind of neighborhood.
Right. It's geography.
It's geography, right?
It's history. Absolutely.
It's a tough line to walk, I imagine.
It is. But, I think India has done a fairly remarkable job
Yeah.
of navigating these complexities.
That's fascinating.
And
Yeah.
I think one of the things that Laxmikanth really drives home
Yeah.
is that, Indian foreign policy is not
Right.
static. It's not based on some kind of, fixed ideology.
Right. It's constantly evolving.
It's constantly evolving.
Right. It has to be.
It has to be in response to
Yeah.
changing circumstances,
Right.
both at home and abroad.
That makes a lot of sense.
So, it's a fascinating, it's a complex.
Yeah.
It's a lot to get your head around.
It is, but that's what we're here for.
There you go.
That's what these deep dives are all about, right?
Absolutely.
It's about kind of taking this deep dive
Yeah.
into these topics that
Yeah.
are complex,
Right.
but also incredibly important
Absolutely.
to understanding kind of how the world works.
Absolutely. And I think especially in today's world where India is really kind of, emerging as this
Right.
global power.
As a global player.
Understanding how
Thinking
Indian
about-
politics works
Yeah.
is more important than ever.
It's essential, I would say.
It-
If you want to understand kind of the 21st century,
Absolutely.
you have to understand India.
Absolutely. You cannot ignore India.
Well, on that note, I want to say thank you so much
Thank you.
for taking us on this deep dive
It's been a pleasure.
into the world of Indian politics.
The pleasure is all mine.
It's been so fascinating, and, we've just scratched the surface, as we always do in these deep dives, but hopefully it's enough to kind of,
Whet the appetite.
whet the appetite, exactly.
Yeah.
And encourage our listeners to go out and learn more.
Absolutely.
So thank you again, and for our listeners.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Indian politics.